Hello, and thanks for taking the time to view this recorded version of After the Fire, Seeding New Mexico's Future. My name is Colin Haffey, and I'm the Conservation Manager for the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico. The first half of the webinar is a talk by Dr. Owen Burney, who explores the challenges and opportunities in the reforestation pipeline. We've dedicated the second half of this recording to answering questions posed during the live event. For those of you who don't know, the Nature Conservancy is a science-based conservation organization that works with diverse partners to protect land and water to benefit people and nature. The Conservancy in New Mexico has been doing important conservation work for the state for over 40 years. After the Fire, Seeding New Mexico's Future is a new effort designed to bring life back to 4,000 acres of scorched land in Bandelier National Monument and the surrounding Jemez Mountains. In 2011, the Las Conchas fire burned 156,000 acres in the area, making it one of the worst fires in state history. We are working with a group of partners including several pueblos, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service to plant trees in large burn scars where they will not be able to grow back on their own. Our project is a science-based approach that aims to plant the forests that are ready for the climate 100 years from now. We are grateful to the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund for the generous grant to support this effort. The reforestation project falls under the scope of the Nature Conservancy-led Rio Grande Water Fund, a collaborative effort with more than 80 partners designed to thin 600,000 acres of dense forest to prevent dangerous fires like Las Conchas. In addition to thinning overgrown forests, we're now focusing on reforestation. Our partners in reforestation on this slide make the work possible. Everyone has contributed time, sweat, or funding to this effort. Truly without them, this project wouldn't be possible. Our presenter today has been involved in our project since the beginning, and he has provided us science-based guidance on reforestation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Owen Burney. Dr. Owen Burney is an associate professor in the Department of Plant and Environmental Sciences at New Mexico State University. He is a superintendent of the John T. Harrington Forestry Research Center in Mora, New Mexico. Dr. Burney's primary research and professional interests are in forest restoration and regeneration, nursery systems, tree improvement, and international development. He's especially interested in uncovering fundamental mechanisms that explain growth and physiology of forest trees in response to environmental stressors and silvicultural management. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Forest Science from the University of Georgia, a Master's of Science from Oregon State University, and a doctorate from Purdue. Owen's presentation today will focus on the larger issues of the reforestation pipeline, both in New Mexico and around the world. Thanks so much for joining us, Owen. Take it away.
Thank you, Colin. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And thank you everybody for participating today. This is a very important topic. I know it's an unusual setting in the virtual world, but maybe we're all actually getting accustomed to it, sadly. But today I'm going to talk about the challenges to the reforestation pipeline. And this is from seed to nursery to outplanting. But before I really get into that, I want to give a little bit of background on the John T. Harrington Forestry Research Center, as well as the current state of our forests here in New Mexico, as well as the Southwest. So the Research Center is one of 12 agricultural experiment stations associated with New Mexico State University. We are the only one that is conducting work in forestry research. We're located in Mora, which is up here kind of in between Las Vegas, New Mexico, and Taos near Santa Fe. Our main campus, for those who don't know, is in Las Cruces, so down in the southern portion. So we're kind of better positioned to do a lot more work regarding forestry in Mora. A lot of the programs that we focus on at the Research Center kind of are based on three main elements. So one major program is our operations. So our seedling nursery production program is the largest in the southwestern United States. We have a capacity to grow about 300,000 seedlings per year. We grow about 35 different species of trees and some shrubs as well. Obviously, research is in the title of our center, so we do conduct a lot of research. We focus on areas such as nursery systems, tree improvement, which is really about genetics and genetic gains, forest restoration, and so this really is about post-fire planting efforts, and then mine reclamation. And then since we are a part of the university system, education is a big part of what we do. And a lot of that has to do with our undergraduate and graduate training opportunities, either through internships or through research. We also work with researchers from other institutions such as Northern Arizona University, Utah State University, and many other programs. In terms of land managers, we work with land managers from a variety of entities, from pueblos to nonprofits to Forest Service. And of course, we really like to reach out to the general public. So we do that through workshops and field day activities. So the forests in New Mexico occupy about 25 million acres of forest, which is about a third of the state. And that is actually a lot more forested acres than what you see in Arizona, Utah, or in Colorado. And one really important fact about these forests is that they supply about 58 to 77% of the renewable water used by municipalities and agriculture within the region. So the current forest conditions that we see right now are really a function of what has happened in the past. And around the mid to late 1800s, grazing was prominent within the Southwest, where we had millions of sheep and cattle. And these sheep and cattle actually reduced a lot of the native grasses that were the primary fuel source for a lot of the natural fires that we see that have occurred in the past. So that has contributed to our current condition. Additionally, around World War II, we had a very aggressive fire suppression campaign. And the idea was to protect our timber resources. However, it was a deleterious effect from that really improved or had a major impact on our forest densities around the state. And then here we see a photo, two photos actually. The top one is from 1900 and the bottom one is from 2012. It's from the same forest in right outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico. In that top one, we can see a very low density forest, but because of poor management, which is really a function of a lack of thinning and fire suppression, we see this increase in fuel densities and high density forest conditions. And what that really equates to is we see high density forests throughout the region, and that also equates to high fire risks. And so what we see for our forest trends and a future condition for our forests in the Southwest is really based on where we are in terms of our thinning needs. And so this is really a reflection of how dense our forests are in New Mexico. Right now in New Mexico, as of 2018 actually, 6.9 million acres were required for some kind of thinning or fuels reduction operation, which is significant. And then we couple that with warmer, drier conditions associated with climate change, and what we will see is a recipe for an increase in very large catastrophic fires. And this trend has been going on for the last few decades. So some of the major fires that we've had over the last 2 decades, so from about 2002 to 2019, have resulted in about 300,000 acres of burned lands per year. And some of the dominant fires that have existed in the most recent decade, the Los Conchas fire in 2011 was about 156,000 acres, which is one of the projects that we're working on with the TNC group in order to do some restoration work in Bandelier. The very large fire, the Whitewater Baldy fire of 2012, burned almost 300,000 acres. And then very recently we had our U Park or the Philmont fire which is a part of the Philmont Boy Scout Ranch up in northeast New Mexico in 2018, burned about 36,000 acres. So the impacts of these fires are significant, and they have a very negative impact on wildlife habitat. They have a negative impact on soils in terms of erosion. They impact commercial products such as timber. And of course, we already kind of talked about seed banks and seed sources. So if we have this very large area that has been burned over, it has an impact on the ability for that to naturally regenerate. So there is a complete loss of a seed source or a seed bank to help assist regenerate that forest back into its natural system. And of course, it has an impact on recreation like fishing and hunting, and water. Water resources are significantly impacted by fires. Here we have a fire, the Los Conchas fire in 2011. And this is actually taken from the Santa Clara Pueblo. And you can see most of the watershed is completely denuded as a result of that fire, except for some of the trees within the riparian area. And the fire isn't the only issue. We also have, after the fire, major problems with flooding and erosion. And you can see that the Santa Clara Creek was heavily impacted by this fire. It basically turned it into a parking lot. So one way we can address these issues with these disturbed landscapes is through reforestation or planting of trees. And so the fire footprint in New Mexico for 2002 to 2019 was about 5.2 million acres in total. And not all of that needs to be planted. We're really trying to target those areas scientifically that we think need to be planted to kind of restore and rejuvenate those landscapes. And there's a new study that's being produced by the Nature Conservancy that's really looking at the reforestation opportunities in the entire United States, but they also break it down by state. So they have some data for New Mexico. And what they found was that about 2 to 2.6 million acres are required for some kind of reforestation opportunity. And this isn't just for fire footprints or those high severity fires, but it's also areas that are abandoned agricultural lands or abandoned pastoral lands. But if we look at these numbers of acres, we also have to translate that to the number of seedlings. And so they really, when we look at 2 million to 2.6 million acres, that translates to about 300 to 650 million seedlings at a density of about 150 to 250 trees per acre. And one thing we need to consider is that future fires will occur. And on average, we need to be adding about 10,000 acres of high severity areas that would be required for planting per year. So on top of that 300 and 650 million seedlings, we need to be planting an additional 1.5 to 2.5 million seedlings per year. So what has been done in terms of reforestation efforts in the Southwest? Well, in New Mexico and Arizona, there's actually not a lot that's happening outside the Forest Service and some pueblos in terms of reforestation after the fire. And what has been done is really a drop in the bucket. And it's not all their fault. There's a lot of resources that are just limited in making those efforts happen. And what's also interesting, there's very few studies that have actually looked at tree planting with regards to restoration efforts after fire. There was one study that was done in 2015 by Jesse Utz, who was the graduate student of Tom Kolb at Northern Arizona University. And they looked at 8 fire sites across New Mexico and Arizona where they were comparing planted trees to natural regeneration. And what they found was that the planted trees actually were more successful in promoting proper stocking levels, meaning they were more successful in creating the normal densities of that future forest than the natural regeneration on those high severity fires. So that was a very positive note for the need to be planting trees. Sadly, the negative note is the average survival for those planted trees was about 25%. And looking at this study and some of the management prescriptions that have happened fairly recently, one of the reasons is the effort really only goes into the planting, and then it's basically kind of dropped away after that. And so there's this plant and walk away approach, which isn't very valid and may be a reason why we see these very low survival rates. So the challenges that we see to the survival of these planted trees really boils back to even before that. We really have to ask ourselves a question of, do we need to plant or not plant? And there are land managers out there who have a blanket approach where they just say they don't want to plant. Or some may say they want to plant everything. And really, that is not the idea that I want to convey. The idea that we should be using is a very science-based approach on whether or not we should be planting areas that have been disturbed by fire. And the way we want to do that is really through addressing all these little components of the reforestation or restoration pipeline. So this is what I'm going to go through right now and talk about these components and the challenges associated with each of the components. So we're going to talk about seed, we're going to talk about nursery systems, we're going to talk about outplanting, and we're going to talk about post-planting. So the first component is seed. And I think it's pretty obvious, but I think I still have to state it, that without seed, we can do absolutely zero in terms of reforestation and restoration. So we need the seed to make that work. So basically, we need to be collecting seed like we're a bunch of hungry squirrels. And I think that's a really big piece. However, that also happens to be our biggest challenge. And that is that here in the Southwest, and I would argue across the US and the globe, that there's actually very little effort being placed on seed collection in the Southwest. And this is due to a combination of factors. One is just a basic knowledge gap. There's not a lot of understanding from land managers on how to properly collect seed. Cone production varies by time. There are bumper crop years. And so for some conifer species, for example, we only get cones every 3 to 8 years. And so we have to react to that type of production. And I think we all understand that funding is a big piece of this. So that is a limiting factor for a lot of folks in order to do collection, which is very expensive. But even if we made a decision to improve our collection and increase that capacity, one of the big things that we need to consider after that is our storage capacity of those collected seed. And one idea would be to establish regional seed banks. And this is kind of like a cooperative agreement among different institutions, public and private, where they buy into these seed banks. And there needs to be redundancy in that system, because if you throw all your eggs in one basket and we lose a seed bank for some kind of malfunction, we lose all that seed. So the idea is that we need to have regional seed banks that are a buy-in by a multitude of institutions with redundancy built in. And the way to really think about seed banks is to think about them as an insurance policy for disturbance. So we cannot go back to these burned landscapes and collect seed. So we need to be collecting the seed in preparation for that future disturbance, because there's a lot of genetic diversity out there, and for us to be able to collect it and then put it into a bank gives us the options for future decisions. If we don't have that seed, we have no future options of how we're going to restore those landscapes. So one important thing about seed is that in that collection process, that gives us an opportunity to improve our genetic diversity. So by improving that diversity, that allows us to build a buffer against changing environmental conditions, such as climate change. And so when we have that diverse seed bank, there are options for us to move those seed sources around outside their normal range in direct response to climate change. And this is the very basic definition of assisted migration. So what is assisted migration? Assisted migration is really this. It's climate is changing faster than some native plants can adapt or migrate. And so we need to, as humans, plants need that assistance to migrate to suitable climates. So the idea is that we would be moving seed sources that are from the south into more northern locations, or from lower elevations to higher elevations. And we've been doing this a long time. We've got Johnny Appleseed, who's been moving seed sources around forever and ever, but we want to do this in a very science-based approach, so we understand the consequences of how we move our seeds around. So one of our, I have an example about how we move our seeds around, and having a question about how do southern, local, and northern sources differ. We have a ponderosa pine provenance test that was planted in 2012. We have 75 sources, which are all represented by these yellow dots throughout the landscape, and it ranges from southern New Mexico all the way up to British Columbia. And these 75 sources were basically, so they were planted in 2012, and we have results that are 5 years later looking at their growth and survival and how they compare to one another. And so what we have here is the location of where things are planted. So this is the Mora Research Center, and you can see that we've got our sources from all over the range of ponderosa pine. And the results, what we did is we took heights and ranked them in the top 25 based on source. And we see here we have a height of 134 centimeters down to 101 centimeters. And the red indicates southern sources, the green indicates more local sources, and the blue indicates northern sources. And what we found was, of the top 25 heights by source, 19 of them were southern sources. And it suggests that there are opportunities to work with assisted migration as a tool, not as a blanket approach. I don't think that is the right way to go, but it is a tool in the toolbox that we need to consider when we are doing restoration efforts on these burned landscapes. So the next component in the pipeline are nurseries. And there was a paper that was produced by Diane Hossey with the Forest Service and Anthony Davis with Oregon State University in 2017 that talked about the importance of nurseries, but some of the challenges. And what they stated in general is that nurseries are too often off the radar in the forestry world, and that they are considered a low priority or even unnecessary. And thus many don't actually receive the adequate resources and funding or even staff to conduct the work that they need to do. And I think that we need to change that mentality. We need to prioritize nurseries. So looking at some statistics of nurseries, so seedling production in the United States in 2018 for all nurseries was approximately 1.2 billion seedlings. In New Mexico, we grew 58,000 seedlings. In Arizona, 1,800. And in Idaho, we grew 10.7 million seedlings. And the reason why I'm including Idaho is because they have 2 U.S. Forest Service nurseries there, which supply seedlings to New Mexico and Arizona, but they also supply seedlings to Washington, Idaho, Montana. So we're only getting a fraction of those seedlings. So if we look at these numbers and we go back to that TNC report, to the reforestation opportunities and the reforestation needs just for New Mexico, we see, if it loads here, that planting needs in New Mexico, again, is 300 to 650 million seedlings, with an additional 1.5 to 2.5 million per year. So this is going to take over 100 years for us to actually meet those needs unless we make some changes. And that actually brings me to our biggest challenge in nurseries, and that is a lack of capacity to meet those growing demands for reforestation and restoration efforts in New Mexico, and I would argue around the world. And the second biggest challenge is to ensure that the production of the seedlings are of high quality. And that is for current nurseries as well as those that may be coming online. And the way to do that is by using the target plant concept as a model to make sure that those seedlings being produced are of the highest quality. And for a quick little background, the target plant concept, the short definition is matching the right seedling to the right site. And this is done through 8 elements. Basically, we're looking at using reforestation restoration objectives that are very clear and well-defined, evaluating the site and those limiting factors on that site, mitigating those measures of that limiting factors on the site, incorporating genetics into what we're doing, planting plant material in terms of how we grow the seedlings, and then outplanting tools, techniques, and windows. So I'm going to use an example of what we're doing right now in terms of how we're implementing the target plant concept into our research. So a lot of the areas that we're focused on are these high severity disturbed post-fire sites, which are really harsh and dry. And so for us to match the right seedling to the right site, what we're proposing is a conditioned seedling, a drought conditioned seedling that will grow and survive on those harsh sites. So the way we are doing this is by intentionally limiting irrigation during that initial growth phase in the nursery. And the objective of this study is to determine if this type of conditioning alters plant quality, and that's in terms of morphology, physiology, anatomy, hydrology, that promotes growth and survival. So we have 2 treatments in terms of our drought conditioning. We have a high irrigation treatment, or our control, which is the typically used irrigation system for most nurseries. And then we have a low irrigation or drought condition treatment, which is basically pushing that threshold. We are stressing our trees throughout that entire growing period. And what we want to do is see how we're changing that seedling anatomy through that first period of growth in the nursery. And the way we did that was we took the seedlings and subjected them to a staining or a dye that allowed us to look at the xylem tissue that is hydraulically active. That means those tissues that are actually moving water. And you can think of the xylem as straws that are moving water from the soil to the roots, from the roots all the way up through the leaves, and from the leaves out into the atmosphere. And so what we see in the high irrigation, these blue areas right here are the stained xylem vessels or elements that are conductive. So they're the ones that are actually moving water from the soil through the leaves. And when we compare that to the low irrigation, we see a significant increase in the number of xylem that are conductive. And the reason why this is important is that it allows us to build a buffer when we plant these seedlings into the field against those future drought stresses. So if we have more xylem or straws that are conductive, they will potentially be lost through that drought period. But if we have more of them, it builds a buffer against those stressors. So how does this translate to seedlings performance in the field? Well, we planted ponderosa pine in a very hot, dry, low elevation environment where we knew they would die just north of Flagstaff. The idea was to intentionally kill these seedlings, but we wanted to see how those treatments separated out. So we have here on the bottom axis days since planting, and then we have survival. So when we first planted, we had 100% survival, and then we have our blue line as the control, and we have our red line as the drought condition seedlings. And we begin to see this separation at about day 30, where we have those drought conditioned seedlings living longer. And this potentially would translate to better survival on sites that are maybe not as harsh, but still harsh in terms of those footprints that we want to plant in a post-fire environment. So what does this mean? It means that the seedlings that we produce in the nursery, that quality, those drought conditioned seedlings translates to very improved performance in the field. So the next component of the pipeline is outplanting. And what do I mean by outplanting? It's all the activities surrounding tree planting. So for example, we have site preparation. That could be controlling competing vegetation. That could be working with any kind of soil amendments or any kind of soil preparation work. It also relates to transportation. How are we going to get those seedlings from the nursery to the field and protect those seedlings along the way? And another piece of that is storage. So how are we going to store these seedlings at the site so that they're also protected? We have planting windows as another factor, and that is, when are we going to plant? What time of year, what season, what time of day, what weather conditions? And then we have planting techniques. And this is the tools that we're going to use, or where we're going to be planting these trees specifically in terms of the microsite. So outplanting has some major challenges with it. And I think the largest one in New Mexico and within this region is really identifying that workforce for planting large areas. We don't have the capacity to do that right now. And if we begin building that up, we still need to emphasize quality over quantity. You can grow the best seedling in the world, and a planter can destroy that seedling in a matter of seconds if it's planted poorly. Some additional challenges are basically that entire list of outplanting activities. That is site preparation, transportation, storage, planting windows, and planting techniques. All have room for improvement. And many of these we are addressing in our research right now. So here's an example of an outplanting project that we're working on. And it's really targeting more the planting technique or the microsite location. What we were doing is we're working with the Baez Caldera to restore a burned landscape. And we were using logs as a microsite as a way to promote survival and growth of planted ponderosa pine. And so we had a lot of dead standing timber from that fire, and we dropped it. And if you can see in this photo here, we oriented these logs in an east-west fashion. And we have replications of logs versus no logs across this landscape. And we planted seedlings on the north side of the log or out in the open where there was no log. And we looked at a lot of factors, but one of the big factors is survival. And so when we look at the control, which are seedlings planted out in the open, we see about 66.7% survival. When we look at the log treatment, we have an increase to about 74.4%. So we see that increase of survival. Now, overall, our survival is great compared to what we saw from that study done by Northern Arizona University. And that's because we fenced the entire site. And hands down, I know that elk and deer are very problematic for a lot of what is happening in terms of our survival issues with reforestation efforts. But going back to an explanation of why we see that change in survival, and we also saw an increase in growth with the log treatment. I'm going to show you this graph here. What we have is time through here. So we have May through November, and we have precipitation and soil moisture. And these lines represent soil moisture for the two treatments, log versus no log, the log being in red and dashed, the control being yellow. And then we have in the blue precipitation events. And in here about mid-July, we start getting the monsoon season kick in, and we see this abrupt increase in soil moisture on that north side of the log where we placed the soil moisture probe. So we see that maintain pretty much through the entire growing season. And that translates to increases in both growth and survival. So the last component I want to talk about regarding the reforestation pipeline is post-planting. So what do I mean by post-planting? These are activities that happen immediately after planting. It could be the same day. So for example, we can be protecting our seedlings from animals. So this could be building fences, putting on shelters, or trapping. We can also be working with soil amendments. So we can go through and do irrigation work, fertilization, mulching, a lot of different soil amendment options. We have options to control competing vegetation for many years out. And by doing this, this helps us increase our water holding capacity and thus the available water for those seedlings to continue to grow and thrive. There are options for passive irrigation systems where available. So if it's extremely dry, it's something to consider. But I think one important piece that's often overlooked is monitoring. We need to know our success stories and our failures so that we can learn. And I don't think that it's happening at the rate that we need to be doing any kind of monitoring work. So what are the challenges associated with planting, post-planting activities? I would say the number one is a lack of commitment and motivation. There are many folks that are just basically using that plant and walk away approach. And I think that's extremely problematic. I think with every component of the pipeline, this one holds true, but limitations in funding and capacity will always be a challenge for all the components. And then I think that there's also the use of short-term approaches for something that is a long-lived species. And so we need to consider different directions. And so some solutions that I have to improve our post-planting efforts, which then translates to approval in survival and growth, is to erase the plant and walk away mentality by land managers. We need to build new valuation for return on investments. So one way we can do that is working with water and carbon markets and how that corresponds to our efforts in terms of tree planting. We need to improve soil conditions. This is through mulching, fertilization, passive irrigation. We have to improve our animal damage control measures. As you saw in the previous project with the logs, when we fence that site, we can increase our survival at a baseline of 66%. So there's ways that we can do that through shelters, fencing, chemical repellents, and trapping. And we need to improve our monitoring efforts. We need to use adaptive management strategies, and we have to implement long-term objectives so that we can follow those seedlings all the way to where they become a future forest. So here's an example of some work we're doing in terms of post-planting activities. We're doing research with aspen restoration in Utah, just outside of Cedar City. And we're looking at using mulch. Actually, we're using the wood chips from aspen as a way to retain the soil moisture and reduce the competition right around where we're planting aspen. And what we found from this study is that in the control, where we've had zero mulching, we had 0% survival. But when we add mulch, that survival goes up to 62%. This is a very important point, because if we're investing, if we think about this pipeline and we're investing in this pipeline from the very beginning, we spend a huge amount of resources investing in seed collection and storage. We have a huge investment in our nursery systems. We put a lot of investment into the outplanting, and then we let go right here. We have lost all that investment. So the problem is we are not carrying through all the way with the pipeline to ensure that those initial investments actually make it to this 62% survival. And so this is an important point. And it brings me to the future directions. I think one of the first things that we need to really consider doing is building a strong seed collection program, as well as establishing regional seed banks. We also need to increase our nursery capacity, and with that, making sure that we have high quality seedlings that are being produced in current nurseries as well as any future nurseries that come online. We have to improve our outplanting resources. This is the labor, obviously the funding, but also the techniques of where we're planting, how we're planting, what tools we're using. And we have to erase the plant and walk away approach. So with that, I'm gonna leave it open to questions. I think that will go to Anne.
Owen, thanks so much for this. It was really great. I'm excited that we've been able to tackle some of these challenges, not all of them, through the East Jemez reforestation work that we're all engaged in, and really learning, I think, is at the center of that project. And so as we engage and move forward, I'm really excited to have you guiding us through it. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne, who's going to walk us through some of the questions. It looks like we've got quite a few in the chat, so we definitely won't be able to get through them all, but Anne's got the challenge of finding the best ones. So go ahead. Anne, you're on mute. Gotta unmute you.
All right. Can you all hear me now?
Great. We can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Sorry about that. We had a little technical difficulty there. So I want to make a couple of points here before we get started, that in the questions for Owen and all of us, maybe, there are a couple of things that, some really great questions about technique, but also some offers of help. So we'll try to tackle some of both of that. And I just want to acknowledge how much we have learned from Owen, working with him on this process of reforestation, the project that Colin is mentioning. And that I think it's really important for all of us to understand that when we pay for baby trees to put in the ground, that all of these pieces are critical. And that that is what we in the Conservancy and our great partners who are working on these issues with us, like Owen, are trying to address all of those pieces, from capacity and storage and finding the right seeds and so forth. So it's a big process, and we're all trying to be engaged as much as possible. So let me get started with the questions, and I'll do my best to get through as many as I can here. And the first one really is about cost, Owen, and generally, like on a per acre basis, what does after a fire, what are you thinking the cost might be? And I know you gave us some kind of range of trees per acres, but that kind of acre figure tends to be something that people can relate to.
Right, you know, that's something that we're trying to figure out. Given that there's not an industry here really to do this, we don't have a lot of references to go to in terms of a very, precise cost for these efforts. You know, our rough estimates are probably, if we're going to push through and make sure that pipeline works and that we have high survival rates, is going to be, $1,200 to $1,500 an acre. And it seems very expensive, but there's economies of scale. And so basically, maybe as we promote this industry in terms of restoration, those prices can be driven down. But again, we don't have a really solid number to base that on, because we don't have a very large reforestation program. So the very quick calculations that we've done already is about $1,200 to $1,500 an acre, which is expensive.
Thanks.
But about the same as thinning. But thinning is pretty expensive.
Yeah, it's about the same as taking away trees is about as expensive as putting them back, it seems.
Yep.
Okay, so then I just had a great message here from our partner, Mary Stuver with State Forestry, who worked on the White Mountain Apache reservation in Arizona, and she speaks to some trees that the tribes were able to plant in their program over time, and that's been an important part of our efforts generally, is to include our indigenous communities with us, because obviously they have a lot of knowledge and have a lot of interest in restoring these landscapes. We have a question about genetic diversity. We talked a little bit about provenance and the difference north to south, and this kind of leads me to ask a question, is sort of, are we looking for particular kinds of trees? Are they different than the kinds of trees that we used to look for? And how do you think about improving genetic diversity?
Right. So, historically, a lot of collection was based on commercial value. And a lot of the seeds that we still have today are considered superior trees. So these are the best trees from the best sites. And we think they have definitely value for what we want to do in terms of future restoration, but we need to incorporate potentially the best trees from the worst sites and the best trees from marginal sites and those intermediate sites. But the key is we do need to be collecting from a larger range of areas because we don't really know exactly what that future holds for us. And we do know that one way to build resiliency into a system is to have that diversity. So instead of just going after these best of the best, we do need to look for very healthy, dominant trees within a landscape, but look at different ecotypes. We need to look at very dry sites. We can look at the best sites. And by doing that and having it across a larger area, we can build that resiliency in the system, which will protect us, in theory, from those future conditions, those stressors that will be a part of our future climate, primarily being warmer and drier. And so if you're just using 10 sources as all you have, I think you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. We really need to increase our seed collection from a wider range of areas. But again, going after the healthier, dominant individuals.
Thanks. That leads to yet another question, and it really, I think this is a great one, thinking about that, capturing and retaining the diversity, and that has to do with your point around seed storage. I know we were kind of astonished at how old the seeds were that we were going to use for our project in the Jemez. So maybe you could speak a little bit about seed storage and viability and just kind of what we're using right now in the project we're working on together.
Right. So, depending on the species, we can store seed from, up to potentially 50 years. But as we begin to expand that time, so as soon as we begin storage, they're not going to get any better. So their viability begins to degrade. Certain species, they don't store at all. There are certain oak species that we can't even store them. We haven't figured out how to do that. Aspen, what we found, is about 5 years for aspen seed. After about 5 years, they just drop out. So really, it depends on the species. So for us, the importance is, and this is what we did with the Nature Conservancy and Bandelier, Santa Clara Pueblo. We all worked together to do a large collection last fall. And that allowed us to get about 300,000 seeds that were now being used for our restoration efforts in Bandelier. So we have a new crop that's been collected, but it was, again, a drop in the bucket. This is something that needs to be an ongoing process, and we need to have that funding source and that ability to react to the production, because seeds do not last forever in storage and their viability just decreases through time. So we need to replenish and we need to use those seeds when we can.
Thank you. So the question, because we've kind of focused our attention on these post-fire areas, a question about why do many burn areas not regrow on their own and require like our intervention for reforestation?
Right, so when we talk about ponderous pine, we'll use that as the example. Their seed dispersal mechanisms, that means how seed is moved from the tree to the ground. It's probably by air, but there is some other, animal vectors. But it really isn't too far, 150 meters away from, the parent trees. And when you have these very large, severe fires, it burns all those mature trees and seed sources above ground, but also the seed bank, so the seed that's in the soil. So if there's no seed source around, you're not going to get anything for a very long time, because it has to progress through the spatial component of where the seed source starts to the next crop that grows and can produce seed and continue on and on and on. And so it's going to take a while for those areas to become restored, because these are not very natural, large, catastrophic fires. We don't see this. And so we are trying to restore these areas by putting in tree islands through planting, which will become a future seed source to help regenerate that entire landscape. So yeah, for us, really the big thing is it's not coming back naturally in those high severity fires. And there needs to be our help, a human effort to accelerate that restoration effort, because naturally it's going to take a century or more before we actually see something come back in.
So we had a good question about fire, because you made the point that we needed more fire, we lost it, and now we're having these big mega fires. And so how did the kind of natural fire regime not interfere with reforestation? What was the difference?
So say that one more again. Sorry, I missed the...
Yeah, so sorry. So I was saying that you made the point that fire has been a part of these environments historically. And then someone has asked, how do current megafires impact natural forest regeneration differently than healthy fires?
Well, I think we kind of stated that just before. These megafires basically are obviously not natural. So they're extremely large. And so you have this huge footprint that no longer has that seed source. And so we're not seeing the natural regeneration occur. And so that's why we have to come in and actually, human effort wise, come back and plant, because otherwise it'll take, a century or more before we actually see those forests restore to their natural systems. So the megafires are just unnatural, and we need to kind of change that trajectory through planting.
Yes, and I think the other thing that at least I've certainly noticed in looking at areas that have been burned, at least in kind of our drier conifer forests, is that trees like ponderosa pine, they have this like super thick bark. People may be familiar with that. And so the fires that happened earlier, where we still had the grasses available and more open country, that thick bark tends to provide an insulation. And those trees are actually pretty tough to the lower intensity fires compared to what we're seeing now, where we're really losing, all the trees. The canopies are just being nuked. So I think maybe that might help a little bit in the difference between those two fires. Yeah. So on the Jemez project, you mentioned provenance and thinking about south to north, and we are also working with you, I know, on just kind of experimenting with what the species might look across the landscape. And when you talk about that kind of migration, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that idea.
Yeah, so the project that we're working on with the Wildlife Conservation Society and TNC and Bandelier and Santa Clara Pueblo and Highlands, I think we've got a big group of us, is, the idea is, the assisted migration has a lot of components to it. So one thought we have that we want to experiment with is taking species from a lower elevation and moving them up in elevation. So for example, we're looking at taking pinon pine from its natural elevation and moving it up into the ponderosa pine elevation and planting it with ponderosa pine. So we have that working in concert. And then we're doing the same with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. So we're taking ponderosa pine seedlings and planting them in that mixed conifer zone up in elevation. And the idea is that, that is kind of the trajectory for climate change. And we want to see how they respond now to outplanting. There could be some negative effects for planting at this point in time, but there's only one way to know, and that's through testing. And so as the projections are for warmer and drier, if we begin to see that shift occur, we want to be ahead of that curve, because the climate is changing faster than seed dispersal mechanisms can move. And so that's what we're trying to do, is match that rate of change. And the only way to do that is through planting or direct seeding, but moving those seed sources through an assisted way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I wanted to point out too that, as Owen is saying, there's kind of a a big team of us that are trying to work on this project in the East Jemez, and we're really lucky to have some scientists that have also thought hard about under climate change in up to say year 2100, what are the environments that will still exist where we're likely to be able to support trees like ponderosa pine and Douglas fir and pinon and so forth. So we're targeting those modeled areas with that mix of species that Owen is mentioning. And then we had a question about the nucleation technique. And so maybe that would be something we want to touch on here in the last minute or so, and allow people to understand how we're kind of incorporating not only the needs of the seedlings, but fire as well.
Right, so the nucleation strategy is something that came about from some projects that were done in tropical environments, but you know, the idea is that we're trying to emulate natural regeneration patterns. And so if you see what happens on the landscape, we don't see planting in a grid system across the entire disturbed landscape. What happens is you get these very dense, groupy, clumpy seedlings coming in. And so we want to emulate that. And by doing so, one, it kind of is on that trajectory for a natural system. But two, you know, we're not having to plant that entire landscape and recreate the same problem we had before, which is a extremely dense forest that is going to be prone to a severe fire in the future. So if we have these islands that are scattered about, and part of that is understanding how many we have, how big they are, how dense they are, that's some of the research that we're conducting. But the hypothesis is by having these scattered about the landscape, one, it's not going to cost us as much to restore these landscapes. It emulates natural systems. And then as they develop and mature, they'll actually begin to disperse their seed and help fill in some of those gaps, while at the same time allowing fire, hopefully in a low intensity, low severity condition, to maintain those understories to a certain extent and not really take out these tree islands or nucleations. And if we do have a fire that moves into those nucleations, maybe it only takes out that one or a few, but it has a buffer against potential future fires as well. And there's a lot of other benefits to these nucleations that includes, you know, ideas of holding on to snow packs for a longer period of time on that northern side, and maybe even working together to kind of create more of a little micro ecosystem, because you know you have these nurse environments for other native plants and species to move into, as well as creating wildlife habitat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Owen. And I apologize for those of you who put in the great questions and comments, and I didn't have a chance to get to them. But I would like to invite you, you can see on the screen here right now, if you have questions for Dr. Burney, that you go ahead and share that question with him. If you have questions about our specific program, you will receive a thank you for participating in this webinar, and hold on to those questions, and you're welcome to reply back to Sally, whose address will be on there, and then she'll make sure those questions get to those of us that are working on the project. And for those of you who are so generous and are thinking about how to help, and especially with the question about seed collection, I can tell you that right now that we're looking for what might be the best way for people to help us identify those cones and those locations where we can get the seeds, because as Owen said, there were it has to be very episodic, and sometimes we have bumper crops and sometimes we don't. So in this last moment here, I'd like to invite you to take a quick poll. And what we want to do is make sure that we get your information and how well the information we presented kind of went over with you, so that we can continually improve. And I thank all of you, and I thank Owen in particular for sharing his expertise with us and with all of us here on the webinar. And I just want to just say it's been so personally rewarding for me to work on this project. there's just been an awful lot with going on right now in the world. It's been super challenging. And to be able to think about working on a project with these very knowledgeable people, thinking about how we can heal the landscape and do some things that are really beneficial to not only the forests themselves, but to assist all of us in maintaining our water supplies in New Mexico and the important wildlife habitat. So thank you so much again for participating, and there'll be more to come. We'll keep you informed as we progress on this project and other efforts that we're making jointly to reforest New Mexico and share what we learn here elsewhere in the world. I have to acknowledge, I saw one of my colleagues from South Africa attending the webinar because we work on very similar questions. So we're happy to share and we're happy to learn from all of you. And again, thank you for your offers of help, and do not hesitate to contact us again. So with that, I just would like to thank all of you and look forward to our next session. And thanks, Owen.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, everybody.